9 judges, 0 dissents, a former president with nowhere left to run. The Supreme Court of the United States has just rejected Donald Trump's emergency appeal, and they did it unanimously. That includes the 3 justices he personally appointed to the court. Less than an hour after that ruling, George Will, the conservative Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist who has shaped Republican thinking for 50 years, went on national television and said something that should have every American stopping cold. He called Trump's legal strategy completely and irreversibly collapsed. I've seen legal setbacks. I've seen political defeats, but I've never seen a moment like this. Today, I'm going to explain exactly what happened, why it happened, what George Will's reaction tells us about the fracture inside American conservatism, and what this means for the 2024 elections. Because this is no longer just about one man's legal problems, it's about whether the Constitution still works. Let's get into the details. Let me set the stage clearly because there is a lot of noise out there, and I want you to understand precisely what occurred. At the end of last week, Trump's legal team filed an emergency request with the Supreme Court. They asked the justices to pause all proceedings in his federal election interference case while they considered a much bigger question: presidential immunity. Here's the argument they presented. In simple terms, Trump's lawyers claimed that a former president cannot be criminally prosecuted for actions taken while in office. Any actions ever. If you think about what that would mean in practice, it's extraordinary. It would essentially place presidents completely above the criminal law. You commit a crime on Monday, and as long as you were president when you did it, you are untouchable forever. Now, Trump's team had a strategic reason for this appeal beyond the legal argument itself. According to multiple legal analysts, this was their last realistic chance to delay the trial until after November. If they could just push the court's timeline past the election, he might win back the White House. And if he is president again, those federal prosecutions effectively disappear. So this wasn't just about legal principles. It was about survival. The Supreme Court's response came faster than almost anyone expected. According to Politico's January 7th reporting, the court rejected Trump's request without a single noted dissent. Let me be clear about what that means. Not one of the 9 justices thought his emergency request had enough merit to even justify further consideration. Clarence Thomas, who has been criticized for potential conflicts of interest given his wife's involvement in post-election activities, said no. Neil Gorsuch, Trump's first pick for the Supreme Court, said no. Brett Kavanaugh, whose confirmation Trump defended through intense controversy, said no. Amy Coney Barrett, rushed onto the court just days before the 2020 election, said no. All of them. Every one of them. And it wasn't just a procedural denial. According to CBS News reporting, the court's order included specific language that went to the heart of Trump's legal argument. The unsigned order stated that the request failed to demonstrate that the petitioner is likely to succeed on the merits of his immunity claims. Let me translate that from legal language into plain language. The justices are telling Trump that his core argument, that presidents cannot be prosecuted, is not going to work. They are signaling that even if this comes back to them in a full appeal later, he is going to lose. Legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin, appearing on CNN shortly after the ruling, called it the most definitive rejection of presidential immunity claims in American history. That's where we are. That's what just happened. Now I need to explain why George Will's reaction matters so much. Because if you're under 40, you might not fully appreciate the weight this man carries in conservative circles. George Will has been the intellectual conscience of American conservatism since before Ronald Reagan took office. He won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 1977. He was a founding panelist on ABC's This Week and shaped political discourse for generations. He wrote speeches for Republican presidents. He advised countless conservative politicians on everything from policy to philosophy. This is not some liberal commentator cheering from the sidelines. This is not a Democrat looking for partisan advantage. George Will devoted his entire professional life to building and defending the conservative movement in America. When he speaks, the old guard of the Republican Party, the people who remember what conservatism meant before Donald Trump arrived, pay attention. So when the Supreme Court ruling came down, I was watching for his reaction. And within an hour, he appeared on Fox News and delivered what I can only describe as a legal and moral obituary for Trump's defense strategy. Here's what he said, and I am quoting directly. What we witness today is the complete evaporation of a legal fantasy. The notion that a president, having lost an election, could attempt to retain power through extra constitutional means and then claim immunity from prosecution was always constitutionally absurd. It is now legally dead. Think about who said that. A man who defended Republican presidents through scandals and controversies for half a century. A man who built his career on conservative principles. A man whose words carry the weight of conservative institutional judgment. When George Will says something is constitutionally absurd and legally dead, that's not partisan rhetoric. That's a verdict from inside the conservative movement itself. He went on to say that this moment represents a stress test for American constitutional governance. He pointed out that Trump's response to this ruling and the response of his supporters will tell us whether the Republican Party remains committed to the rule of law or has, in his words, devolved into something unrecognizable. Coming from a lifelong conservative, that is a devastating indictment. Here's what most people are missing about this Supreme Court decision. It is not an isolated event. It is part of a pattern that reveals something deep about how our institutions really work when they are tested. Donald Trump has built his political identity on demanding absolute loyalty from every person and every institution around him. And time and again, he has discovered that the Constitution and the rule of law do not bend to personal loyalty. Let me walk you through this pattern because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Start with Bill Barr and the Department of Justice. Barr came out of retirement specifically to serve as Trump's Attorney General. He wrote the memo that framed the Mueller report in the most favorable way possible for Trump. He personally intervened in cases involving Trump allies like Roger Stone and Michael Flynn. Interventions that career prosecutors found so troubling that some of them resigned in protest. By any reasonable measure, Bill Barr was one of the most loyal attorneys general in modern history. He went further for Trump than almost any previous AG had gone for his president. But then came the 2020 election. Trump was claiming massive fraud. He wanted the Department of Justice to back him, to declare the election corrupt, to give official validation to his claims. Barr investigated, looked at the evidence, and found nothing. The claims were baseless. According to Jonathan Karl's reporting for ABC News, when Barr told Trump the truth, that there was no evidence of fraud that would change the outcome, Trump exploded at him in the Oval Office, yelling, saying that B had betrayed him. B resigned shortly after. Trump has attacked him viciously ever since, calling him weak, stupid, disloyal. But here's what really happened. Barr told the truth. That was his sin. Not disloyalty to Trump, loyalty to reality. Now look at what happened with the Supreme Court during the 2020 election challenges. Trump and his allies filed more than 60 lawsuits challenging the election results in multiple states. They went to the Supreme Court multiple times, fully confident that the 3 justices Trump had appointed would come through for him. After all, Trump had told his supporters that's why those appointments mattered. He said he needed his justices on the court in case of an election dispute. But the court rejected every election challenge, often unanimously, often without even agreeing to hear oral arguments. Trump appointed a third of the current court, and they ruled against him repeatedly, not because they were disloyal, but because his claims lacked legal merit. The law does not care who appointed you. Then there's Mike Pence. Pence spent 4 years as perhaps the most deferential vice president in recent memory. He defended Trump through the Access Hollywood tape, through Charlottesville, through 2 impeachments, through every imaginable controversy. He was the bridge between Trump and evangelical voters, between Trump and traditional conservatives. But on January 6, 2021, Trump demanded that Pence do something the Constitution did not allow him to do: unilaterally reject electoral votes and overturn the election results. Pence refused, not because he was personally disloyal to Trump, but because the Constitution gave him no such power. He took his oath to the Constitution seriously. And for that act of constitutional fidelity, Trump turned on him completely. A violent mob stormed the Capitol chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." According to testimony before the January 6th committee, Trump expressed support for that sentiment as he watched it unfold on television. 4 years of unwavering loyalty meant nothing the moment Pence chose the Constitution over Trump. Even Mitch McConnell, who spent years accommodating Trump, pushing through his judicial nominees, blocking Democratic legislation, even McConnell reached his limit after January 6th. After voting to acquit Trump on procedural grounds, McConnell took to the Senate floor and declared Trump practically and morally responsible for the attack on the Capitol. Do you see the pattern here? Every person, every institution Trump expected to bend to his will eventually reached a moment where the law or the Constitution required them to say no. And every time that happened, Trump treated it as betrayal. This Supreme Court decision is just the latest chapter in that pattern. 3 justices Trump put on the court looked at his legal argument and found it without merit. They did not betray him. They did their job. Let me explain why Trump's legal team is now in an impossible position and why this goes beyond losing a single appeal. Trump's entire legal strategy in the federal election case was built around delay. According to the Washington Post's January 6th analysis, his team privately expressed confidence that they could push the trial past November through a combination of appeals and procedural maneuvers. The plan was straightforward: file motion after motion, appeal after appeal, drag everything out, and hope the calendar ran out before a jury was ever seated. According to MSNBC's legal analysis, Trump's lawyers filed more pretrial motions in this case than in any recent federal criminal proceeding in memory. They challenged everything: venue, the judge, the constitutionality of the prosecution itself. At first, it seemed to be working. Every appeal takes time. Every motion requires a response. The clock kept ticking. But then something happened that Trump's team did not anticipate. The courts began to move fast, really fast. Judge Tanya Chutkan denied motion after motion, often using blunt language, criticizing the defense's arguments as lacking merit. When Trump's team appealed her immunity ruling to the D.C. Circuit, that court not only rejected his claims, it issued a sweeping 57-page opinion systematically demolishing his legal reasoning. The Court of Appeals wrote that the president is not above the law and that accepting Trump's argument would grant presidents a lifelong get-out-of-jail-free card. Still, Trump's lawyers had one more card to play: the Supreme Court. Surely, they thought, the justices would want to take their time with this historic question. They would hold oral arguments, write long opinions. The process would take months, pushing the trial well past November. That calculation has just turned out catastrophically wrong. The court said no, immediately, unanimously. What does this mean practically? On January 8th, Judge Chutkan issued a new order setting a trial schedule. She wrote that the defendant has exhausted his appellate remedies with respect to the immunity question and that there is no legal basis for further delays. Her language was remarkably direct. She wrote that the defendant's repeated attempts to postpone these proceedings harm the public interest in the timely resolution of criminal charges and the integrity of the judicial process. That is as blunt a rebuke as you will see from a federal judge. Here is the impossible dilemma Trump's legal team now faces. On the one hand, they need to maintain the support of Trump's political base. According to a January YouGov poll, 71% of Republican primary voters believe Trump is being unfairly targeted by politically motivated prosecutors. Any lawyer who publicly acknowledges the weakness of Trump's legal position risks being fired and attacked. On the other hand, they have to actually defend Trump in court, where judges are not impressed by political rhetoric. They need real legal arguments, and their strongest argument, presidential immunity, has just been destroyed at every level of the federal judiciary. An effective legal defense at this point would probably require Trump to do things he seems psychologically incapable of doing: acknowledge wrongdoing, express remorse, maybe cooperate with prosecutors, but Trump's entire brand is built on never admitting fault, never backing down, never showing weakness. He still cannot accept that he lost the 2020 election, much less that his attempts to overturn it were criminal. Andrew McCarthy, a former federal prosecutor and contributing editor at National Review, a conservative voice who has often been sympathetic to Trump's legal positions, went on Fox News and said that Trump's legal team is now in a position where their best arguments have been rejected at every level of the federal judiciary and they have nowhere left to go but trial.